Welcome back to this introductory series of talks on corpus linguistics, devised by Wendy Anderson and me, John Corbett. Today we're going to look at corpora and language variation. We're going to look briefly at two kinds of variation. We'll look at the kinds of variation that happen in the standard language, variation according to situation, usually known as register, variation according to communicative purpose, known as genre, and variation according to personal aesthetic choice, style. And we'll also look at an area that has been less well served so far by corpus linguistics, though this is changing, and that is geographical variation, the difference between, say, British English, American English, or Indian or Australian English, or the Englishes spoken in nations and regions within Britain, or the USA, India, and so on. There are quite a few articles and books that you can consult for more depth on these issues. As ever, Wendy Anderson's and my book on exploring English with online corpora includes discussions of language variation. Douglas Biber and Susan Conrag's book is an excellent introduction to register, genre and style. And there are also relevant sections in Tony McHenry, Richard Chow and Yukio Tono's indispensable resource book, Corpus-Based Language Studies. Most large-scale corpora are based on standard Englishes, and they're intended for use in compiling dictionaries and grammars of standard English. More recently, however, corpora of different non-standard varieties, Scots, local Irish English, learner corpora, and English as a lingua franca corpora, have been developed. These are usually smaller, and they often incorporate spoken data. This session looks at ways of using both corpora of standard varieties and non-standard varieties to explore language variation. We'll begin with variation within the standard language. Variation within standard English is often described in terms of three distinct but often confused topics: register, genre, and style. Register is variation according to situation. The language used in casual conversation is different from that used in a business meeting, for example, which is different again from that used in a written football report in a newspaper, and so on. The big online general corpora, like COCA or BNC, allow us to look at different registers of English, for example, academic English versus fiction, or magazine English versus spoken English. We can see how lexis and particular grammatical structures are distributed in each register. Genre refers to variation according to communicative purpose. So, for example, an academic research article will have a different purpose from a magazine advertisement. Genre analysts usually consider how the overall shape of the text or discourse is structured in such a way as to achieve the communicative purpose, which might be to stake a claim to new knowledge in a research article or to promote a commercial product in an advertisement. Some texts clearly have primary and secondary purposes, and genre analysts break the text down into textually signalled moves. Style refers to systematic aesthetic preferences. All of us have certain linguistic preferences that we exhibit in speech and writing. Some corpus analysts focus on, say, the stylistic preferences that can be used to identify a particular writer's work. The plays of Shakespeare have been analysed, for example, to identify those sections that might have been written by a collaborator, whose lexical and grammatical preferences differ from the traditionally assigned author. Now, the labels that we use to identify registers, genres and styles overlap to a certain extent. Academic, for example, might refer to a situational variable, a scientific topic, formal written language, for example. Or it might refer to a communicative purpose, to stake a knowledge claim. It might even be used of an individual's written style to indicate a kind of stylistic preference. However, when used in their technical sense, register, genre and style are different, and they have implications for corpus design and searching. The table on this slide is taken from Biber and Conrad's book, Register, Style and Genre. For register analysis, as we can see, there can be a focus on sample texts. We are looking at any linguistic feature, lexical or grammatical. The features are spread out throughout the text samples, and we assume that these features are shaped by the communicative situation. For genre analysis, since there is more of a focus on discourse structure, we need to have access to the whole texts. We tend to focus on those rhetorical linguistic features that signal textual moves, sometimes called lexical priming, and these features tend to occur in specific places in the discourse, and we assume that these features help to realise the communicative purpose of the discourse. For style, as with register, we can make do with text samples. Any lexicogrammatical feature can serve as an aesthetic like or dislike, and they are spread throughout the samples. They are evidence of preferences rather than communicative situation or communicative purpose. We can use the chart function of the general Brigham Young University corpora most easily to analyse register. The search here on the slide is for instances of the get passive, like he got caught, rather than the be passive, he was caught. As we can see, the get passive is a feature of speech and fiction, more than, say, academic written discourse. Corpus evidence confirms our intuition that the get passive is a common feature of speech and avoided in formal written English. So this kind of search is easily performed using online corpora, and the Brigham Young University corpora are a great source of evidence for register variation. They are perhaps less immediately useful for genre or stylistic analysis, but it is fair to say that the availability of corpora has really reinvigorated the study of register. As noted earlier, corpus linguistics has paid relatively little heed to geographical variation so far, though this is changing. One of the earlier corpora to look at geographical variation was the Scottish Corpus of Text and Speech, or Scots corpus. This is a relatively small corpus overall nowadays, with around 4 to 5 million words, but about 25% of the corpus is spoken. Its contents range from Scottish Standard English to different geographical varieties of Broad Scots, and so it can be used to check and illustrate many features of Broad Scots and Scottish English. The data gathered in the Scots corpus is not balanced or representative. The data was gathered opportunistically, which is a grand word for randomly, and so it raises a number of issues about corpus design and the possibility of generalising about the language varieties that it illustrates. But it does demonstrate vividly the range and complexity of language use on a geographical basis, as well as showing how language varies according to the social class, age and gender of the speaker. It's an untagged corpus, but you can search for words and phrases and do concordance searches online, and there are a few other types of search that you can do too. The written part of the Scots corpus includes a lot of transcripts of proceedings of the Scottish Parliament, including formal reports and formal written transcripts of originally spoken events like debates. There's a smaller amount of personal text, such as letters and diaries, and there's a certain amount of published and hitherto unpublished literary material, both in English and in Scots. The spoken part of the corpus contains lectures, talks, interviews, and informal conversations, though these are recorded with the knowledge of the participants. Again, like the literary material, the conversations range from standard Scottish English to broader Scots. The most direct way of using the Scots corpus to explore language variation geographically is to search it for those linguistic features that people have argued are specific to or characteristic of Scottish speech. This might be lexis that is specific to a particular dialect, or certain grammatical structures. Such features are described in the Scots Dictionary record and in the sociolinguistic literature about Scotland, and we can look at a few of them here. Let's begin by thinking about Scots vocabulary. The great Scottish lexicographer, Adam or Jack Aitken, suggested that we think of Scottish vocabulary as being on a continuum of Scottishness to Englishness. On the left side of the continuum, in column 1, there are those words that are now purely restricted to Scotland. Words like bairn for child, ken for know, or caup for capsize. Some of these words might have been shared historically with English, but now they're restricted to some Scottish speakers. In the second column are words that are cognates of English terms. They share a common etymology, but the Scots form is slightly different. So we have mere versus more, stain versus stone, hus versus house, and so on. The middle column is those words that are shared by both Scots and English. Words like winter or some are shared by both varieties, and no specifically Scots word exists to express these concepts. Column 4 gives the English versions of the Scots terms in column 2, and column 5 supposedly shows words that are particularly English, in that distinctively Scots terms do exist to express them. So conspicuous could be expressed as kenspeckle in Scots. So column 5 is the English equivalent of column 1. A corpus, in theory, should shed insight into how these expressions are distributed in the output of a speech community, or even in a single conversation. What is the distribution of column 1 words and column 2 words, for example? How do speakers vary between columns 1 and 5, or 2 and 4? The Scots corpus shows us that lexical usage is in fact complex. We don't simply have Scots speakers or English speakers, but we have speakers who vary along the continuum. In this conversation with a speaker from Fife, for example, we see her using bairn in one conversational turn, but kids and children in other conversational turns. Speakers with Scots repertoires, then, move back and forth along the continuum. If we start comparing frequencies of occurrence of certain items in the spoken part of the Scots corpus, then, it's not surprising to find that both column 1 and column 5 items appear, although the raw frequencies of the English items outnumber their Scots equivalents. Lass occurs 50 times, but girl 424 times, for example. Again, some rarer items do not figure at all, even in a corpus of 1 million words. Chaffed and gowpen do not appear. Even the English word jaw only occurs 5 times. So to get a better picture of Scottish speech, we would need a much larger and more systematically constructed dataset. If we turn from lexis to grammar, we can use the Scots corpus to illustrate things like noun morphology. In this case, how is the plural formed in Scots? In most English words, obviously, you add s or es, though there are some exceptions. For example, oxen and children use an otherwise archaic Old English plural with en. Some Scots words whose present-day English counterparts have s still use the Old English plural n, like in, the plural of e or I. So twa in Scots would be 2 i's in English. And in this excerpt from northeast Scotland, we can see a mother teaching her child the plural form. The mother is naming parts of the face, here the nose and the in, which the child mispronounces as eeks. Another grammatical feature of Scots is to use a particular kind of determiner, the numeral, with a singular noun. So a male speaker from Fife says twa hunner pun, and twa year, and twa hus. Again, as with the Lexis, his performance varies from Scots to English, as later in the same conversation, the same speaker talks about 3 inches and twa layers of felt. So here he does use the plural form of the noun in combination with the numeral. We can continue building up our picture of how grammar works in contemporary Scotland by looking at verbs. A weak or regular verb in English will normally form its past tense by adding the inflection ed. For example, walk becomes walked, or warn becomes warned in English. A strong or irregular verb will change its medial or closing vowel, so sell becomes sold and know becomes new in English. But in Scots, a verb that's irregular in English may be regular by adding the Scots it or t to the stem. So for example, in Scots, selt corresponds to sold, or kent corresponds to new. We can see these weak Scots forms of the verb in this extract from the speech of a Shetlandic speaker. Finally, we can look at a grammatical feature of Scots speech that is shared with other non-standard Englishes, the so-called reduced verb paradigm. Most regular English verbs have 2 parts, e.g. walk and walked, which appear in phrases like I walk, I walked, and I have walked. Strong verbs have a 3-part structure, like know, knew, known, as in I know, I knew, I have known. Irregular verbs also have a 3-part structure, as in I go, I went, I have gone. In Scots, as with some other varieties, verbs with a 3-part structure often have it reduced to 2, giving forms like it's went, as in it's went hard, it's gone hard. This example from the Scots corpus again shows the verb reduction in a child's contribution to mother-child discourse. As well as lexical and grammatical features, the Scots corpus illustrates a number of distinctive discourse markers, like the token C, to mark a new topic or a shift in topic. This is evident from our Fife informant again. See your house indicates that the topic of the contribution will be the listener's house. The listener in this exchange, which happens to be me in this case, responds with the Scots minimal response token, I. So, what can we conclude about language variation from this short introduction? First, the largest expenditure of time and money has been in creating large-scale corpora of standard English, and we can now do sophisticated and statistically robust analysis of those features that characterize a particular register. With some effort, we can also code and search for genre features. Given the oeuvre of a particular writer or set of writers, we can also identify particular stylistic preferences. All this can be done. A less comprehensively addressed area is that of geographical, social, age-related or gender-related varieties of language. There is less of a commercial driver for large-scale systematic corpora of this type, and they pose challenges to the corpus designer. How do we transcribe speech? How do we deal with variant spellings? How do we do automatic part-of-speech parsing when the words and structures are often spoken and non-standard? For Scottish speech and writing, we would need a massive corpus to do justice to the range of spoken and written varieties, even within the space of a small nation. The Scots corpus scratches the surface, but it can still be used to illustrate a number of features that arguably make Scottish speech and writing quite distinctive from Standard English. Thanks for watching.